Welcome, comrades and friends, and nice to greet you on International Women's Day. Tonight's talk is on socialist women. But before the meeting starts, I will remind you all this is also the memorial lecture for Margaret O'Leary, who sadly died last year. And I think before we start, Margaret was probably well known to a lot of people listening here tonight. She was a staunch member of the Workers' Party for many years, all the way through its, from the beginning of the 70s or before the beginning of the 70s, the struggles there, and again in 1992, and has always clung firmly to her socialist principles. And a great loss to the party. She was also actually the editor of Women's View throughout its lifetime. So before we start, I'm going to ask her daughter Jenny to say a few words about in tribute to her mother. Okay, Jenny.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jennifer Cassidy, and I'm Margaret O'Leary's youngest daughter. Can you hear me okay, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
Before I go on. Firstly, on behalf of the Cassidy family and extended O'Leary clan, I would like to sincerely thank the Ard Corla for their wonderful gesture and naming this lecture in memory of our wonderful mother, Margaret. It's an incredibly proud moment for us all. The Workers' Party was a huge part of Margaret's and our lives. As children, we were regularly brought to marches, and we spent many a day in Gardiner Place, colouring or doing homework while she worked. Margaret even worked right up until the day we were both born. She'd only just made the journey home from Gardiner Place to Finglas and was making dinner for my sister Lorna when she went into labour with me and had to rush back out to the rotunda. 4 years ago, at the March for Choice, we walked under the Workers' Party banner along with 3 of Margaret's grandchildren. Also during that campaign, Margaret, my sister Lorna and myself spent some time leafleting around the Finglas East area. Our mum always celebrated International Women's Day, and without fail, she would text us a Happy Women's Day message every year. That is just one of the many little things we will miss. It is now almost 4 months since, on 17th of November last, we all received the terrible news that Margaret had died. Our shock, sorrow and disbelief was all the greater because of its suddenness. Our mum had shown no outward signs of illness and indeed had been into her workplace briefly on the morning before she died. When Margaret died, the Workers' Party Ard Corla in its tribute stated, "Due to the restrictions of COVID-19, we cannot gather or stand together to bid Margaret farewell. However, we will remember her, and when it is possible, we will gather to honour her." This third and devastating wave of the pandemic means that a physical gathering to honour Margaret still awaits. However, it is particularly appropriate that it is today, International Women's Day, that we gather via the internet for the Margaret O'Leary Memorial Lecture. Sorry. Margaret lived a full and fulfilled life. Her life encompassed family, both immediate and extended, her work, her politics, her internationalism, her voracious reading and interest in culture in all its forms, her support for the Dubs, and above all, her feminism and her commitment to the struggle, not only for women's equality, but women's liberation. For her friends and colleagues in the Workers' Party, Margaret was a comrade for 52 years. She was an activist, never afraid to publicly proclaim her politics or her support for any political objective. She was a practical person, never afraid to roll up her sleeves and get her hands dirty. And when she promised to do something, it was done. She was a deep thinker and a strategist. From her first days in the Republican movement in 1968 until her death last November, she remained true to the ideals of socialism, the unity of the working class, non-violent political struggle, and the total opposition to sectarianism of any variety. Margaret was always open to change, to new ideas and new tactics. She realised that political and economic circumstances over which the working class had no control necessitated the socialist movement internationally and also the Workers' Party, adapting to meet these new challenges. She was ready to embrace change. But on one issue, Margaret was steadfast. She was steadfast in her commitment to socialism and her loyalty to the Workers' Party. For almost 20 years, Margaret was a full-time employee in 30 Gardiner Place. During this period, not only was Margaret pivotal in the weekly production of the Irish People newspaper, she was a candidate, a member of the Ard Comhairle Central Executive on several occasions, a member of the Women's Committee, both locally and nationally, a shop steward for her co-workers, and an absolutely key member in initiating, producing and maintaining for 11 years the Women's View magazine. In the 27 years after she ceased working full-time for the party, and in her 25 years of dedicated work for the Irish Council for Social Housing, Margaret was always available to the Workers' Party with information, advice and practical assistance. It is sad, but perhaps also in some ways fitting, that two of Margaret's last public political acts were participation in the Workers' Party contingent Feel the 8 demonstration, and later that year, delivering a heartfelt and moving eulogy in Liberty Hall for her comrade of 50 years, Sean Garland. I'm going to wrap it up now, but I would like to thank you all for taking the time to listen. I would also like to say a massive thank you again to the Workers' Party for inviting me to do this. I'm very honoured. I will now leave you in the capable hands of Claire O'Connor. I hope you enjoy the rest of the lecture, and happy International Women's Day to you all. Take care.
Thank you, Jenny.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, our speaker for the evening this evening is Claire O'Connor. Claire is the Dublin regional organiser for the party and a member of Dublin Central Branch. And she's going to speak tonight about 3 women in particular who have had a big contribution towards the struggle against anti-fascism. So without any more from me, over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Hilary. Thanks very much. And thanks very much, Jennifer. Happy International Women's Day, comrades and friends. And I'm very glad to speak tonight as we remember our friend and comrade, Margaret O'Leary, and to reflect on the contribution of women, the contribution of socialist women and working class women to the struggle against fascism in the last century. To do this, I'm going to speak a little bit about Sylvia Pankhurst, Dolores Ibarruri and Nora Harkin, before reflecting on some of the lessons we can draw from these extraordinary women in the context of the contemporary reality. So we begin by focusing on Sylvia Pankhurst, and I think it perhaps speaks to the way in which history can pigeonhole and compartmentalise the role of political women that Sylvia Pankhurst is mainly remembered today as the fighting, militant socialist suffragette. As a young woman, Sylvia found her voice in the fight for votes for women. However, this was only the beginning of an exceptional life on the left. She was born in 1882 in radical Manchester to a family where fierce intolerance for social injustice ran strong in the blood. Her descendant on both her paternal and maternal sides were Chartists and protesters against the Corn Laws. Her father, Richard Pankhurst, with whom Sylvia was especially close in her early childhood, was a radical Republican barrister who ran unsuccessfully for Parliament on a socialist ticket. Her mother was, of course, Emmeline Pankhurst, a towering figure in a generation that had been fighting for women's suffrage, fighting across general human rights and feminist causes, right back to Mill's earlier petition 50 years before in the Women's Property Act, which Sylvia's own father had been involved in drafting. The second of the 3 Pankhurst sisters, the eldest being Christabel and the youngest Adela, Sylvia grew up against a background of activism in a deeply political family. The family later lived in London for a while to pursue Richard Pankhurst's parliamentary prospects. They were always surrounded by an enormous diversity of political people, whether these were people working in the incipient Indian nationalist movement, abolitionists, or indeed feminists. This highly politicised childhood set Sylvia on a course which led her through tumultuous struggles, through prison gates, through the peak battles for women's suffrage in the 1910s, and through confrontations with political figures as diverse as Lenin, Shaw, Mussolini, and even at one point a physical skirmish with Churchill. She became a militant suffragette as a teenager, starting out as an activist in what was known as the Family Party, the Women's Social and Political Union, founded in 1906 and tightly controlled by her mother Emmeline. Its organising model was based on the Union of Garment Workers in Manchester and Salford and the early women's movement which her sister Christabel was actively involved in. Sylvia was first imprisoned at the age of 24 and was one of the most arrested, most tortured and force-fed of all the suffragettes. During the period between February 1913 and July 1914, she was arrested 8 times, each time being repeatedly force-fed. She provided graphic accounts in her writing of this ignominious chapter in Britain's history of human rights abuses. Indeed, many suffragettes later died as a result of the horrific traumas they suffered at the hands of the British Empire during this period. It is testament, I think, to the fierce resilience and fearlessness of this remarkably spirited personality that Sylvia went on to live such a full and long political life, despite these appalling and traumatising acts of violence she suffered as a young suffragette in her 20s. Sylvia campaigned for the WPSU to take an explicitly socialist direction, tackling wider issues than women's suffrage and always linking it to a broader context of class struggle. She built a close relationship with British Labour Party founder Keir Hardie, and her socialist politics were made even further evident in November 1913 when she spoke in support of Jim Larkin and the workers in the Dublin lockout, an action which triggered her expulsion from the WPSU and represented the first in a series of grave disagreements with her sister Christabel and mother Emmeline. This strained familial relationship famously broke down when Emmeline and her sister Christabel became enthusiastic supporters of the campaign in favour of military conscription at the time of the First World War. Sylvia, by sharp contrast, was a pacifist, and in 1915 would give her enthusiastic support to the International Women's Peace Congress held at The Hague. These pacifist beliefs that she expressed during the Great War informed Sylvia's views on the rise of fascism in the 1920s, even before Italy and Germany threatened the peace of Europe. With characteristic prescience, Sylvia was one of the first to recognise the danger posed by the rise of fascism in Italy, at a time when Churchill was expressing his admiration for Mussolini. Throughout her life, Sylvia was a prolific newspaper editor and writer, and it was in her Workers' Dreadnought magazine that her opposition to fascism first appeared. This was 1922, the year of Mussolini's march on Rome, which marked the beginning of the rise of fascist governments in 20th century Europe. From the beginning, Pankhurst's opposition to fascism was expressed in explicitly socialist terms. She understood fascism as an agent of capitalism and the bourgeoisie, an interpretation of fascism, including German Nazism, that would be formally adopted by the Third International in 1924. While many British politicians demonstrated ambivalence in regard to fascism in the interwar period, Pankhurst's views of it were consistently negative. She warned that far from offering anything new, this was a purely conservative movement, underpinned by a disingenuous exploitation of nationalistic and patriotic ideology, which ultimately sought to defend the established bourgeois order in a moment of capitalist crisis. Over time, her critique of fascism would become broader and more severe when confronted with the rise of Hitler and the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. Sylvia's anti-fascism was influenced by her partner Silvio Corio, an Italian anarcho-syndicalist exile in Britain. From him and his métier of Italian exiles, communists and socialists, Sylvia learned early on of the rise of fascism in Italy. She travelled there with Corio and was involved in a skirmish with Squadistri or black shirts in Bologna. She located this fascist organising firmly in the conditions of modern industrial society and described Mussolini as, I quote, the renegade ex-socialist who deserted the party to join the Jingos in the war, supplied with funds by the great industrial employers of Italy. She consistently linked fascism to industrialism and, more important, to capitalism. Let there be no mistake, she wrote in 1922, fascism is an international menace, the white terror of modern capitalism. Sylvia urged her readers to recognise the dangers of nascent Italian fascism, warning that its rise spelled destruction for socialism and even the most minor victories won in terms of workers' rights. It stood for an aggressive and oppressive industrial capitalism. She also linked the rise of fascism to the failure of socialism, arguing in a 1923 editorial that the socialists, having failed to make good their promise to create a new society, opened the way for fascism to rebuild the old, quote unquote. She continued to dedicate herself to exposing the truth behind male-dominated bellicose regimes and called attention to the harmful effects that war had on women by applying these same critiques to militaristic fascist regimes. In this way, her opposition to fascism was consistently influenced by her feminist standpoint and concern about the status of women. She was critical of the British establishment's apparent acceptance of fascism, particularly Prime Minister Bonar Law's willingness to continue diplomatic relations with Italy after the fascist seizure of power, juxtapositioning this attitude with the response of the British government to the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution was a menace to capitalism, Sylvia wrote, while Mussolini's fascist revolution in Italy represented a support to it and a ruthless attack upon the working class. Sylvia highlighted the Mussolini regime's targeted intimidation of communists and socialists, including those who still held political office. In an editorial, she detailed how Italian socialist MPs were subjected to physical abuse and police raids, despite the fact that they had been democratically elected. She also decried the practice of the government's fascist squads in destroying the printing presses of their socialist opponents, while government officials were given final approval in the appointment of newspaper editors in order to censor all dissent. She was active early on the issue of Mussolini's intentions for the Empire of the Sun, his plans for revenge for Italy's defeat in Abyssinia. Following the Italian invasion in 1930, she supported the armed resistance of Ethiopians against fascist occupation as, quote, unwilling violence performed with amazing courage. She was a supporter of Haile Selassie, and she linked the Italian-Ethiopian War to British colonialism, working to try to persuade the British state not to effectively form a protectorate and colonise Ethiopia by the back door. Furthermore, she warned that if Mussolini were let away with his racist fascist war in Ethiopia, Hitler would be next. After witnessing Hitler's rise to power in Germany over 10 years after the Fascist Party took power in Italy, Sylvia contended that every partial person who has studied fascist and Nazi history and doctrine knows that its main feature is the violent elimination of opposition and the literal extermination of opponents who refuse to be silenced. Violent suppression of opponents was therefore not unique to Germany or Italy, but would occur wherever fascism took hold, and therefore it could never be tolerated. Sylvia conceived of women as ideal agents of anti-fascism, not least because fascism threatened women's rights and the legacy of the suffrage movement. As was the case during the First World War, she viewed women's absence from international politics as one of the reasons that international peace had been violated and would continue to be threatened. She wrote, "In view of this danger, I utter the strongest appeal I can to women. Rouse yourselves against fascism, because it certainly means war." She believed that women were better suited to be pacifist activists than men because, quote, "the most untutored woman knows in the depths of her heart that war is war, whether the people who are massacred live in Europe or Africa." She called on international women's organisations to take action to mobilise international opinion against the atrocities perpetrated against women in Ethiopia. In doing so, Sylvia continued to carve out a space in the anti-imperialist and anti-fascist movement for women activists, whom she viewed as natural advocates for peace and as such essential actors in the fight to secure lasting peace through international cooperation and involvement in the political system. While Sylvia Pankhurst was supporting the fight against fascism in Italy and Ethiopia in 1936, another revolutionary woman was solidifying her role in history as an iconic and implacable opponent of fascism. Dolores Ibarruri was emerging as a legendary figure of the Spanish Civil War. La Pasionaria, or the Passion Flower as she was known, was a fiery orator, inspiring many thousands of workers through her speeches in the streets of Madrid on behalf of the PCE, the Spanish Communist Party. Her famous No Pasarán speech marked the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, a nearly 3-year struggle between the sitting democracy and Franco's fascist coup. Workers, farmers, anti-fascists, Spanish patriots, Ibarruri cried to the crowds in Madrid in July of 1936. The whole country cringes in indignation at these heartless barbarians that would hurl our democratic Spain back down into an abyss of terror and death. This was a call to unify, a plea to Spain to defend itself against the combined forces of Franco, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy as they approached the Spanish capital. Her words will become the most recognisable anti-fascist battle cry of the era: "No pasarán, they shall not pass." Born in 1895 to a Basque miner and a Castilian mother, Ibarruri grew up in Galarta, but later moved to Biscay and joined the PCE when it was founded in 1921. She was the 8th of 11 children, quitting school at the age of 15 to work as a seamstress and later a cook. As a child, she had aspirations to work as a teacher, but poverty prevented her from completing formal education. And this working class childhood fueled in the young Dolores a hunger for social justice and strongly informed her later interest in socialism, which she explored with her husband, miner and trade union organiser Julian Ruiz. In 1931, with the advent of the Second Spanish Republic, Ibárruri moved to Madrid. Soon she was writing political articles for the PCE publications under the pseudonyms Passion Flower and delivering passionate speeches, always clad in black. In a letter published in Pravda to the Soviet actress who had played her in the 1936 play Salut is Fini, Ibárruri attributed her success as an orator to her ability to express and to become the suffering and courage of the Spanish people. My voice is the outraged cry of a people that does not wish to be enslaved, she wrote. In my voice sounds the cry of mothers, the lament of women in bondage, demeaned and scorned. Ibárruri put this flair for drama and impassioned oratory to good use, travelling around the country to negotiate the release of political prisoners and lifting the spirits of revolutionary militias fighting on the front line against Franco's dictatorship. She encouraged people to fight with knives and hot oil in the face of lack of weapons, and made such famous exhortations as, "It is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees." La Pasionaria advocated to improve working, housing and health conditions, as well as land reform and union rights. The fascists were terrified of her and spread propaganda that she was secretly a man who had killed priests with her bare hands. In 1933, she founded the Association of Anti-Fascist Women, a women's organisation which carried out a crucial role in fighting against the rise of Franco's army. As the Civil War developed, Ibárruri became a key figure. She was one of the most senior figures in the popular government and the Communist Party of Spain at a time when very few women rose to that level of prominence. The name of La Pasionaria sums up an entire era in the struggle of workers and the Spanish people for freedom, democracy and progress. Cuban President Fidel Castro later wrote in an article published for Ibárruri's 90th birthday. The forces aligning in Spain would soon be reflected in the Second World War writ large. While Franco's nationalist forces received support and ammunition from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, the revolutionaries were aided by the USSR and Socialist Mexico, with the international brigades volunteering to fight on their side as well. Ibárruri led efforts to unify the left under a single army. As the Civil War developed, Trotskyists fought with the communist elements, and the Republican movement began to become splintered, leading Ibárruri to refer to the Trotskyists and anarchists as the fascist enemy within. After Franco won the war with Italian and German assistance, Ibárruri was exiled from Spain. She relocated to the Soviet Union in 1939, where she was reunited with her family and was part of a small but powerful contingent of exiled Spaniards in the USSR. Tragically, she also lost her son Ruben to the struggle against fascism. He made the ultimate sacrifice, fighting heroically against Nazi fascism in the Battle of Stalingrad. Whilst in the Soviet Union, Ibárruri maintained her support for her comrades in the PCE and across Europe, and worked as part of the Executive Committee of the Communist International Secretariat and at the Communist International. She continued to write at length in support of those fighting against fascism across Europe, linking this to her support for Stalin and the Soviet Union. She was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party of Spain, a position she held from 1942 to 1960, before then being named Honorary President of the PCE, a post she held for the rest of her life. The Civil War heroine outlived Franco and returned from exile to Spain on May 13, 1977, some 18 months after Franco's death and 34 days after the Spanish government had again legalised the Communist Party. Upon her return, she was duly re-elected at 82 years of age as a deputy to Parliament in the country's first democratic election since Franco's death, again for the region of Asturias, the same region she had represented under the Second Republic. Of course, any discussion of the Spanish Civil War and the Irish left must include the some 200 Irish people who went to Spain to fight against Franco and fascism in the international brigades, military units set up by the Communist International to assist the Popular Front government. Our volunteers fought at Jarama, at Madrid and at the Ebro, among other places, and over 60 of them never returned home. Nora Harkin was a founder member of the Spanish Aid Committee, a group that organised support in Ireland for those that went to Spain to fight fascism. Harkin was born in 1910 in Donegal to an anti-treaty Republican family and was first politicised as a teenager, helping to address campaign envelopes for the Republican candidate in a 1924 by-election. She left Donegal at the age of 21 to work in the Irish Hospital Sweepstakes in Dublin, where she met her husband, then Clan na Gael activist and later a founding member of the Republican Congress, Charlie Harkin. She also worked closely with Dublin Republican Socialists, Peadar O'Donnell, George Gilmore and Frank Ryan, among others. Harkin became a member of the Republican Congress executive, regularly participating in street protests and demonstrations which were cleared by baton charges by the Gardaí. Her politics were firmly socialist Republican, rejecting the brand of militaristic and chauvinistic nationalism espoused by De Valera. She also opposed the subjugation of women in De Valera's 1937 constitution. Harkin worked on the Spanish Aid Committee alongside leading members of the Republican, Socialist and Communist movements in Ireland at the time, including Hannah Sheehy Skeffington as chairwoman, John Swift, Nora Connolly O'Brien, Dorothy McArdle, Ernie O'Malley and Father Michael O'Flanagan. The committee was set up against the backdrop of a conservative Catholic Ireland, where the overriding consideration of the Catholic population at the time was for the plight of the Spanish Church. The Catholic Church in Spain had lended its support to Franco's nationalists on account of owning considerable land, unlike its Irish counterpart, and feeling threatened by the redistributive policies of the Popular Front government. Inevitably, there was violence and deep hostility between the Spanish Church and the organised workers who had formed militia units across the country to defend themselves against the Franco-led insurgents. This led to clerical condemnation of hysterical proportions from the pulpits of Irish parish priests across the Free State, who decried the reported atrocities committed by Reds against the Spanish Church. While the Fianna Fáil government remained neutral, the opposition and virtually the entire press were vociferously pro-Franco. Against this incredibly hostile background of ostracisation and reaction, including recurring episodes of violence and confrontations on the streets of Dublin between members of the Republican Congress and O'Duffy's Blue Shirts, the Irish radical left remained determined to offer some kind of cohesive support for the government in Spain. Speaking of this period in an interview in 1996, Harkin commented, "It was the people, the ordinary down-to-earth people like ourselves from our country who were anti-Franco. Those were the people we supported because we felt that's what we would have supported in our own country had the positions been reversed. We had a committee going, we collected a bit of money to be able to pay the lads something when they came back, and we were able to give them a few shillings a week for a couple of months. We went round and we begged. We went round our friends and we badgered them into giving us a £0.50 a week, so we had support in that way, but it was very mild, very low-key." Harkin also spoke of witnessing young men leave, some never to return, and how one of the largest churchgate collections in Ireland since the time of Daniel O'Connell was held in aid of Franco. She drew a parallel between the struggle of the Fenians in the 19th century and that against fascism in the 20th century. I quote, "There is always a freedom to fight for. It comes in different guises. If there's an oppression or something that young people feel is wrong, they've got to try and put it right." Nora Harkin went on to help form the Ireland USSR Society with Frank and Bobby Edwards and trade unionist John Swift, among others. She was also a founding member of the Irish anti-apartheid movement and organised the sending of material support to prisoners and their families throughout the 1970s. Her political activism also extended to considerable voluntary work for the Irish Family Planning Association throughout the 1970s and 80s. Befittingly enough, this unshakably energetic socialist lived to the remarkable age of 101. So to conclude, I think it's important to note that, interesting as this talk may be, we are not remembering these heroines of the anti-fascist movement for reasons of nostalgia, nor as just an interesting academic exercise on International Women's Day. On the contrary, as members of the Workers' Party and as socialists, we return to Pankhurst, Ibárruri and Harkin, seeking guidance in our approach in a current international context where the spectre of neo-fascism and far-right extremism once again haunts the landscape. These three remarkable revolutionary women understood the importance of a feminist politics which is concerned with more than just equality of women to men. They understood the essential class character of the brutal assault on humanity which the rise of fascism represents. The reality is that the phenomenon of fascist organising always remains centred on perverse eccentricities on the periphery of politics until it is embraced as a last resort, armed and equipped to threaten humanity by desperate elements of the bourgeoisie in the context of the collapse of the capitalist economic order. Thus, we revisit these women on this symbolic day to re-assimilate the lessons of their analysis and draw inspiration from their heroism. More than simply recognising the class character of capitalist society and the fascist menace that it throws up, however, all three women understood the central importance of working class political organisation to defeating it. They did not remain detached from the working class as independent voices, but instead sought to build and played a central role in building mass organisations that could campaign and fight for working class interests and for socialism. Finally, they also grasped the international character of the battle they faced. They understood our common class interest across nations in defeating capitalism and the importance of practical political solidarity in the face of their common enemy. In an increasingly globalised world, we as socialists should reflect on the important role that building strong international political and organisational links will play in winning the battles we will face. I'll conclude with this quote from the great revolutionary Clara Zetkin, the founder of International Women's Day, who, although mortally ill, travelled from Moscow to confront the Nazis, presiding at the opening of the newly elected Reichstag in August 1932. When the men are silent, it is our duty to raise our voice on behalf of our ideals. And when the men kill, it is up to us women to fight for the preservation of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. That's very interesting. I'm wondering, Claire, why you think women are still so underrepresented in politics? Is it because they've sold the line that their job is to stay home and mind the family, or certainly in London, where I'm speaking from, most women, if they're going to pay rents in London, have to go out to work, as well as their husbands. But it's still difficult to mobilise people, women in particular. And I wonder, is it social pressure, do you think? Or do you think this is a capitalist idea to keep women in their place? Or what do you think?
I think it's interesting that you say that, Hilary, because I think one of the things that we're learning as time goes on is that while women still remain really underrepresented in public life, I think it's becoming more and more prohibitive for working class women as opposed to middle class women. And I think that that's an important thing to remember in the context of talking about the contribution of socialist women and working class women. Is that I think in Ireland at the moment, a low-paid woman has a lot more in common with a low-paid man actually than she has with middle-class women. And all of those social pressures that you mentioned, all of those material conditions, the limitations of having to pay rent, the limitations of not being able to pursue higher formal education, and all of these things that help if one wants to build a political career. I think all of those factors are feeding into a situation where it's a bit easier for middle class women now than it is for working class women to fully participate.
Thank you. Yeah, just an interesting speculation, wasn't it? Where we're going. But anyway, does anybody else want to ask any questions about the talk? Nobody appears to be waving at me.
Claire, that was a most interesting talk, and I suppose coming from a situation where I attended another talk today by the Sligo Traveller women, and they were making very much the point about the importance of working class women, whether from within the traveller community or marginalised women outside of the traveller community, that we all had the same fight, you know, and that really this day, International Women's Day, should be very much about this, but that the kind of radical content of International Women's Day and the ethos has actually got lost. You could really feel nearly almost about some of the celebrations, kind of a flippancy, and it's really, really great to have your talk here and to actually bring it back to what International Women's Day was originally meant to be about. And I suppose in the circumstances, also remembering somebody like Margaret O'Leary, my friend, you know, it's just so fitting. And I suppose the point that the women were making today was very much about that link of people, you know, marginalized people. And what crosses my mind here in your talk is about those three women that you have talked about. You know, you mentioned about building international support and how necessary that is in the fight against fascism. Did they ever meet, do you know? Did those three women ever have an opportunity to meet? You don't know, do you?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think so, Mary. It's a really good question. I would love if they did, and I would love to have been a fly on the wall if those three women did meet. It's possible that Pankhurst met Ibárruri. I didn't come across anything in my research that said that they did, but yeah, it would be amazing to put those three women together. I mean, I'm sure that they were active they were all internationalists, and they were active around a very similar period. So I'm sure they knew of, you know, each other's work, but I don't know if they ever met. That's a great question.
Anybody else want to come in?
Oh, sorry.
All quiet.
Right. You've obviously given people a lot to think about, Claire.
Good. That was the aim. Thank you.
Yeah. No other comments, in which case I'll wind the meeting up. But please feel free to speak if you have any questions you'd like to ask or anything else. That was a very interesting talk. Yeah. And as Mary said, quite inspirational. We've got one down here. Chat box. Thanks for the talk. What do you think about the HR celebrations of International Women's Day?
That HR in terms of human resources?
I'm not sure. It doesn't say.
Yes. They
Yes.
said yes. I think that there has been a proliferation in recent years of International Women's Day events by the kind of pro-business, pro-employer community, where really the true meaning of International Women's Day, as founded by Clara Zetkin, has been totally co-opted and reappropriated and colonised by the bourgeoisie, essentially, for their own ends. I think human resources and kind of the strong human resource culture that we have in many companies in Ireland at the moment is reflective of that. It's also reflective of just the lack of trade union density and the lack of trade union organisation among women, which is a real core challenge, I think, for women on the left at the moment, because ultimately if we are to take our place as full and equal participants in society. We need, you know, decent work. We need decent pension rights. We need, you know, to end the gender pay gap, and all of those things won't be won for working class women unless we have collective organisation into a strong trade union movement. So I wouldn't be a big fan of the human resource culture and events around International Women's Day. I don't think they get the point.
Thank you. Eilish wants to ask you, did you come across anybody else interesting during your research for this?
No. I think that there are, I was thinking that actually, I mean, really, in the run-up to this talk, when we were selecting the three women, there are a multiplicity of names who I think would be really interesting to take a look at. We can do that on another International Women's Day. Definitely somebody like Charlotte Despard. I think there were a number of women involved in that Spanish Aid Committee with Nora Harkin. I think Clara Zekin, the founder of International Women's Day, is another figure who we definitely could have done a very interesting lecture on.
Well,
thanks.
you're volunteering.
We'll do that next week, Hilary. Bring everybody back. Do one a week.
Be a lot of research you're setting yourself up for there.
Yeah. There'll be a lot of work in it. But there's many, many women to choose from, many great women to choose from.
Yeah. Indeed, yeah. Yeah. And we don't celebrate them enough. Yeah.
Absolutely.
On that one. Yeah. Any more questions from anyone? We've now I've got the chat box open. You're quite welcome to put them in there. Well, there don't appear to be. Okay, so we'll I can wind this up then. Thank you very much, Claire. Very interesting talk and very interesting people you chose to speak about. And yeah, I hope that we've all learned something this evening. And let's hope we can take this forward and help women to get involved and to see the importance of their role in society. Well, that they do have a voice and they can use it. So thank you very much to everybody. Thank you for attending, everybody, and thank you for your talk. So I'll close the meeting. And that's it for tonight. Thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you.